Imagine a woman, solitary and unyielding, stepping into a world of grit and frost, where the very air bites with a ferocity that could break lesser spirits. In the heart of Montana's unforgiving plains, May arrived at Stone River Ranch, unaware that one of the rugged souls she'd cook for held dominion over this frozen expanse. Snow descended in relentless sheets, heavy as unspoken grief, chilling the land to its bones. December had gripped the earth with an iron fist, encasing the brittle grass in a shroud of ice and draping the ranch's weathered beams in a melancholic frost, as if the place itself mourned forgotten dreams. The wind howled like a tormented beast, tearing through the outbuildings, shaking loose shingles with feral glee and lashing at any exposed flesh with cruel precision. Yet May pressed forward, undaunted. Her coat, threadbare and patched at the elbows, offered scant defense against the cold, and her mismatched gloves, one wool, one leather, seemed a pitiful jest against nature's wrath. Still, her posture remained defiant, her spine a rod of iron, her gaze alight with the raw, untamed fire of someone who had lost everything and found strength in the ashes. A worn satchel dangled from her shoulder, and her boots carved deliberate tracks into the ranch yard's frozen mire. She halted before the cookhouse, where a cluster of cowboys huddled near a flickering fire, passing a flask and chuckling through chattering teeth. Their mirth dissolved as they noticed her, a lone woman, daring to seek something in a realm that yielded nothing without a fight. A towering figure emerged from the group, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes shadowed by distrust. His voice rasped like gravel soaked in liquor. "This is a working ranch, miss. No haven for wanderers or tall tales." May's response was unflinching, her tone a quiet blade. "I'm no wanderer, and I've no tales to spin." He scrutinized her, suspicion lingering. "We've no room for trouble, lies, or girls thinking charm will shield them from the cold." May's jaw tightened, her resolve a silent thunder. Following the tense silence of the previous encounter, the air grew heavier with unspoken challenges. A burly man, his gaze cold and piercing with malice, spat disdainfully on the dirt. "Looks like she crawled out of a saloon's greasy kitchen, or worse, its shadowy back rooms," he sneered, sparking a wave of harsh, guttural laughter among the rough crowd. The first man, however, lifted a hand, commanding silence with a mere gesture. He strode forward, closing the distance until his breath mingled with hers, a confrontation of wills. "So, what do you want?" he demanded, his tone a blade. May held his stare, unyielding, her eyes burning with resolve. "I can cook," she declared, her voice sharp and unapologetic, cutting through the tension like a winter wind. "I've wrestled cast iron over roaring flames, skinned game in the bitter cold, kneaded sourdough amidst howling snowstorms, and conjured soup from mere bones. I can take the scraps from your barrels and feed your men until they're thanking me with full bellies." A heavy pause hung between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the nearby fire, a restless witness to their exchange. "Where do you hail from?" he pressed, leaning in, his scrutiny suffocating, but May offered no reply, her silence a fortress. "This ain't a place for mysteries," he growled. Undeterred, she tilted her chin defiantly. "I know my craft, and I'm not turning tail." After a long, assessing gaze, he stepped aside, jerking his head toward the cookhouse. "We've got 36 hungry men surviving winter, and no decent meal in 2 days. The stove's yours. Want the job? Prove your worth by dawn." May didn't waver. "I'll need flour, salt, a dry cloth, and a shred of respect. Surely that won't kill you." A grunt escaped him, half a laugh. "We'll see about that last bit." As she moved toward the weathered door, her gaze swept over the men once more. Most averted their eyes. Some sneered with mockery, others glared with suspicion. Yet one figure stood apart, unmoving, leaning against a post, tall, draped in a dark coat, his brimmed hat shadowing all but the hard line of his jaw, and a glint of something inscrutable in his eyes. He neither spoke nor scoffed. He simply watched. For a fleeting second, May's eyes locked with his. Did he see her strength, or something else entirely? Even before she nudged open the weathered cookhouse door, a shiver of anticipation ran through May. Stepping inside, she was met by a chilling darkness, the air heavy with the acrid tang of spoiled grease. Rusty pots languished on the sideboards, forgotten relics of warmer days, while empty tins littered the floor like the remnants of a lost battle. Yet in the corner, the old stove stood resolute, a silent sentinel igniting a flicker of unyielding hope in her heart. With a determined breath, she hung her worn satchel on a hook, pushed up her sleeves, and stepped back into the biting cold outside. There, under the gray dawn, stood Caleb, the man in the dark coat, his arms folded tight against his chest. He had known her face long before words passed between them, seen her years ago in Billings, behind the steamy kitchen doors of Rosebell, that gaudy den where men shed their decency like old coats. One cruel night, she had been hauled into a room, accused of pilfering a drink, or perhaps merely standing too proud. A hulking brute had seized her wrist, his grip a vice. Yet May hadn't faltered. No scream, no tears. She stood unbowed, her spine forged of steel, her gaze a blazing challenge. "Dare to break me?" Her eyes seemed to roar. Caleb had watched from the shadows, a silent witness, and done nothing. Now, here she was, snow-dusting her hair, defiance woven into every stride. Without a word, he turned toward the bunkhouse, firelight dancing faintly behind him. A storm brewed both in the heavens and within, and it whispered her name. May awoke before the moon surrendered the sky, the cold gnawing at her very marrow as she tugged on her threadbare boots and coat, the same one that had carried her here. Overnight, snow had barricaded the cookhouse door, demanding her full strength to force it open. Inside, the air was a sharper frost than the world beyond, until she coaxed life into the stove. With gritted teeth, she chipped ice from the water barrel, her hands trembling yet resolute. How could one fight the cold when it seeped into the soul itself? As the embers from the previous night's fire glowed faintly, May knelt by the hearth, feeding it pine kindling with hands that trembled from the cold. Slowly, the warmth crept into the air, banishing the ghostly wisps of breath fog. Her fingers burned with stiffness, her back throbbed with a dull ache. Yet she moved with the resolute grace of a survivor, one who had weathered storms far fiercer and refused to be broken. 15 cowboys meant 15 hungry souls to feed, a relentless tide of need. She kneaded flour into a stubborn dough, carved hearty strips of salted pork, and let them sizzle lazily over the cast-iron skillet. The biscuits emerged rough and unyielding, but steaming with promise. She paired them with coffee so potent it could jolt the weariest heart back to life. At first, the men grumbled under their breath. One dared to ask where the real cook had gone. Another's laughter cut through the air, sharp and mocking, as he quipped, "She's probably poisoned the beans." Oh, how their words stung. But by the third dawn, something shifted. They shuffled to the benches early. Their plates scraped bare, the coffee pot passed from hand to hand like a sacred relic. No one spoke words of gratitude, yet every last crumb vanished, a silent testament to her grit. May toiled in quiet determination, scouring pans, wiping down the table, even sweeping ash from the cookhouse corners without a whisper of request. Caleb, always the first to arrive, slipped in each morning at the same hour. Wordlessly, he hefted logs into the firebox and departed without fanfare. A nod from her, a faint tip of his hat from him. Nothing more. His eyes evaded hers. A deliberate distance. She noticed. He bantered with the others, shared their table, but with her there hung a heavy silence, not of scorn but of something guarded, as if he feared what might surface if their gazes lingered too long. Yet, wasn't it curious? He alone fetched an extra bucket of water unprompted, left a fresh bar of soap by the basin without a word. What unspoken weight did he carry in that quiet? As the bitter winter gnawed at their resolve, May trudged on, her boots wearing thin from endless toil. She remembered the quiet figure who, after witnessing her near tumble by the woodpile, had taken it upon himself to smooth the icy steps without a word of acknowledgement. His kindness was unspoken, yet as constant as the frost. One chilling evening, while dragging a heavy bucket of melted snow across the frozen expanse of the yard, May's boot snagged on a treacherous sheen of ice. She plummeted, the bucket escaping her grasp, water spilling in a frigid arc across the pristine snow. The impact stole her breath, a sharp sting shooting through her wrist as she struck the unyielding ground. A hiss escaped her lips, her teeth clamping down to stifle a cry of pain. Before she could gather herself, strong arms enveloped her shoulders. "Caleb!" His name burst from her in surprise. How had he crossed the yard so swiftly, as if propelled by some unseen force? "Are you hurt?" His voice was a low rumble, laced with concern. May blinked up at him, his face mere inches from hers, shadowed by the brim of his weathered hat. Warmth seeped through his gloved hands, anchoring her trembling frame. She managed a faint nod, her breath shallow. "I'm all right," she murmured. Gently, he guided her to her feet, one hand steadying her elbow, the other a firm support at her back. But the moment she stood, he withdrew, stepping back as if he'd trespassed into forbidden territory and feared the consequence of lingering. May gazed at him, searching his averted eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He gave a curt nod, turning toward the barn without another word. That night, as she sat by the stove tending to her scraped palm, her thoughts lingered on his fleeting glance. A look of recognition, yet unspoken, as if she were a memory he dared not voice. What burden kept him so guarded? Caleb's silence was unlike any she'd known, heavy with something fear perhaps, or a hidden remorse that she couldn't yet decipher. As the echoes of the previous night's unease lingered in her mind, she couldn't shake the gnawing question, what was it he feared to voice aloud? It began as a mere murmur, a ripple in the stillness. Red Callahan, a fiery young cowboy with a reckless spirit and a tongue that cut like a blade, had galloped into town just 3 days ago, seeking provisions. When he returned, his saddlebags sagged with the weight of flour and beans, yet his words carried a far heavier burden. He bided his time until supper, waiting for the fire to hiss and the men to settle with full stomachs, before reclining on his elbows with a grin that masked venom. His tone was light, almost playful, but the barb was sharp. "I've seen her before," he drawled, tilting his head toward the cookhouse where May toiled in solitude. Back in Billings, at the Rosebell. The name dropped like a stone into still water, rippling unease through the camp. Everyone knew the Rosebell, a den of vice masquerading as a saloon, perched just off Main Street, draped in velvet curtains, reeking of cheap whiskey, where women forced smiles through hollow eyes. Red's grin widened, his stained teeth glinting. "She wore an apron there, too," he sneered. "Always carried the scent of sage and smoke. Cook, they called her, but we all know how those girls get dragged upstairs when the bottles run dry." Laughter sputtered among the men, some awkward, others cold and callous, hardened by endless winters and empty days. No one truly challenged Red. They let his words sink deep, taking root in the silence. May didn't hear the tale that night, but come morning, she felt its shadow. The cowboys trickled in for breakfast, their steps hesitant, their gazes averted. The familiar clamor of tin plates and rough voices was stifled. One man coughed, mumbling under his breath. Another abandoned his plate by the door, shunning the table. Their politeness remained, but kindness had fled. And May understood. Oh, how she knew. Those sidelong glances, the hushed tones, the way their eyes slid away. Hadn't she seen it all before? As the echoes of past misunderstandings lingered from the previous days, a chilling distance settled among the camp. Good men, once companions, turned into strangers the moment they believed they had unraveled a fragment of her history. Silence hung heavy. He uttered not a single word. Meanwhile, she toiled in her familiar routine, stirring the simmering beans, slicing strips of bacon with precision, and pouring coffee into tin mugs. Her hands moved with the same steady cadence, yet her shoulders bore a new rigidity. A silent burden. The faint smile she once wore, fragile yet genuine, had vanished, replaced by a gaze that never lifted from the ground. By midday, no one ventured to sit beside her near the crackling fire. As dusk painted the sky, not a soul offered to ease the weight of the water buckets she hauled. And still, she held her tongue. What could she possibly say? She had labored at Rosebell, crafting meals with care, not trading her dignity. But to the narrow eyes of certain men, such nuances were invisible. They saw only what they wished to see. May had learned through bitter years that to defend oneself too fiercely was to invite greater suspicion. Let them whisper, she had endured far worse storms. Yet Caleb had overheard the venomous words too. Unlike others, he didn't smirk or chuckle when Red spat his vile remarks. Nor did curiosity flicker in his eyes. Instead, he fell into a brooding silence, gazing into the fire as if it held answers to a torment long buried within him. That afternoon, when Red sneered again, some cruel jab about leftover girls and leftover stew, Caleb snapped. Without a word or warning, his fist struck like lightning, a resounding crack against Red's jaw. Red crumpled to the dirt, blood staining his lips, shock etched on his face. "What in blazes is wrong with you?" he bellowed, clutching his injury. Caleb offered no reply. He loomed over Red for a fleeting moment, fists tight, chest rising and falling with raw fury. Then he turned on his heel and strode off, wordless. refusing to meet any gaze, even May's, who watched it all unfold from the shadowed threshold of the cookhouse door. That night, a gentle snow began to drift down, steady and soft, like ashes descending from some distant, mournful height. May lingered awake longer than usual, her thoughts as restless as the falling flakes. As the echoes of the day's turmoil lingered from the previous moments, May found herself in the quiet sanctuary of her kitchen. The space gleamed with a humble tidiness, the stove simmering gently, casting a faint glow. She sat close to its comforting heat, her hands wrapped around a worn, chipped mug of tea purchased with her hard-earned coins. Her mind churned with confusion. What had driven Caleb to strike red? Why this sudden eruption? And why, oh why, had he not confided in her? Was it pity that stirred within her, or guilt, or perhaps a deeper emotion she feared to acknowledge? Just past 10, a faint knock broke the stillness, so soft it might have been the wind's trickery. May rose, her heart constricting, and eased the door open. The night revealed no figure, only the silent dance of snowflakes and, on the stoop, a modest basket. Peering inside, she discovered a dozen brown eggs, still radiating the warmth of the hen, nestled beside a cloth-wrapped sack of cornmeal, bound with coarse twine. No note, no signature, yet she knew. Those eggs could only have come from the roost by the barn Caleb's daily task. The cornmeal bore the familiar stamp of the town's general store, a place Red had visited, with Caleb in tow. Kneeling in the doorway, May brushed a stray snowflake from the basket's rim, her breath forming fleeting clouds in the frigid air. The wind's harshness seemed to soften, just for a moment. She lifted the basket, holding it near as though it were a fragile treasure, and stepped back into her modest haven. For the first time in days, a small, tentative smile touched her lips. She didn't fully grasp Caleb's actions, not yet, but perhaps understanding could wait. Tonight, someone had quietly affirmed her value, without expectation or demand, and that warmth was enough. Meanwhile, in the bunkhouse, Caleb lay restless on his cot, the fire long extinguished. His eyes stared into the oppressive darkness, the wind's mournful howl slipping through the wall's crevices like a somber prophecy. Beyond, the snow blanketed the plains in a hush, serene yet unyielding. Within the cavern of his heart, a memory seared like a molten iron mark, indelible and raw. 3 years ago, under the dim glow of the Rosebell in Billings, that night clung to Caleb like a shadow that refused to fade. They had gathered to revel in triumph, a celebration of a hard-won land deal struck with men whose years doubled theirs. His companions, boisterous and wild, were intoxicated by whiskey and the heady rush of victory. Caleb, younger than, softer in voice and will, had been reluctant to join the revelry, yet yielding was simpler than resisting. So he went along, swept into the haze of heavy scents, cheap perfume mingling with the sour tang of bourbon and sweat. And then, there was her. Amid the clamor, she stood apart, untouched by the garish paint of lipstick or the predatory grins of the crowd. Clad in a simple apron, her hair bound in a no-nonsense knot, she moved with a quiet purpose, balancing a tray of drinks as if willing herself invisible among the raucous throng. But fate betrayed her. A slick patch on the floor sent her stumbling. The tray shattered, liquor splashed, and chaos erupted. A burly merchant, face flushed with entitlement, bellowed in fury. "You wretched saloon wench," he snarled. "Think a modest dress fools anyone?" Another seized her apron strings, jerking her off balance. She faltered, hands trembling, yet her spine stiffened, and her eyes, oh those eyes, burned with unyielding defiance as they met her tormentors. Caleb, frozen at 23, old enough to discern justice but too craven to act, stood rooted, his fists balled, his throat choked with dust and shame. That gaze haunted him still. The same woman, now rising before dawn to prepare meals for men who averted their eyes, scrubbing the cookhouse with weary hands, seeking no gratitude. Tormented by the past, Caleb sat upright, swinging his legs over the cot's edge, the cold wood grounding his restless soul. The ground bit at his soles with an icy chill as Caleb tugged his weathered coat tighter around him. He ventured into the biting wind, his steps deliberate and slow across the snow-draped yard, drawn toward the faint glow of the cookhouse. Inside, a muted light flickered, a silent testament to her sleepless hours. He knew she lingered late into the night, piecing together the torn and tattered, breathing life into what others deemed worthless. Stooping low, he placed a bundle of dry wood on her threshold, a quiet offering without a note or a tap on the door. But tonight, something held him there. Instead of retreating, he slipped behind the crimson brush clinging to the wall's edge, peering through a slender gap in the canvas curtain. There she was, May, seated by the stove's warm embrace, her nimble fingers mending the worn shoulder of her work shirt. Her brow creased with intent, her movements precise yet tender, as if each stitch carried a weight beyond thread. In her stillness there was a sacred grace. How could someone so wounded by the world still face it with such unshaken poise? Shame surged in Caleb, a bitter tide swelling within him. In her, he saw all he'd once failed to be, brave, resolute, enduring. He'd stood idle before. Could he bear to do so again? Inside, May paused, her gaze lost in the stove's dancing flame for a lingering heartbeat before returning to her needle. Her shoulders tensed, memories stirring. She recalled him Billings that night, his eyes on her, watching, yet mute. Not hatred, no, but a quiet resentment had bloomed for the fleeting, foolish hope that someone might raise a voice when hers was silenced. Yet here, at Stone River, it was Caleb who eased her burdens hauling water pots, splitting wood, leaving silent gifts without a whisper of gratitude sought. He never spoke, but nor did he turn away. May's heart thudded heavily in her chest, a storm of unspoken thoughts raging within. Building on the tension of unspoken feelings from before, the air between May and Caleb remained charged with uncertainty. She couldn't quite decipher him. Did she even dare to try? But fate, fierce and unyielding, intervened that very night. As snow tumbled down in thick, relentless sheets, a bitter northern wind howled through the camp, stirring chaos in its wake. Someone, careless in their haste, had piled dry timber perilously near the cookhouse's rear wall. A tiny, unnoticed ember from the stove danced free, kissing the wood with deadly intent. In mere moments, flames erupted, a savage roar tearing through the stillness, unleashed and ravenous. Shouts pierced the frozen night. Men stumbled over each other in panic, pounding on doors with frantic urgency. But May, weary to her bones, lay asleep on the cot by the stove, oblivious to the inferno creeping closer until Caleb burst in. There was no hesitation in him. He barreled through the choking smoke, flung his coat over her trembling form, and scooped her into his arms. Turning his back to the fire's hungry jaws, he shielded her as flames licked down the wall. Sparks seared his sleeves, heat scorched his cheek, yet he clutched her tightly, refusing to falter. When her eyes fluttered open, racked by coughs against his chest, she saw his face, raw, unguarded, inches from her own. In that piercing gaze, the past dissolved. No shame, no haunting memories of their first meeting lingered. There was only this moment, the girl he'd once let slip away, and the woman he'd sworn to protect at all costs. The days turned harsher, snow blanketing the hills in a dense woolen shroud stitching the earth in white. Before dawn, while the bunkhouse slumbered, Caleb would slip into the cookhouse. He'd mutter excuses needing coffee, checking the firewood, but May saw through the pretense. His gaze always wandered to the small black kettle on the back burner, the one she quietly filled with leftover soup from the night before. A silent offering. Each visit his presence spoke louder than words. How could something so unspoken weigh so heavily on the heart? Her hand would linger for just a heartbeat, then wrap gently around the worn, warm handle of the tin cup she'd filled mere moments before. A soft, "huh," escaped his lips, but gratitude never found its voice. She didn't mention that the coffee had been poured long before his boots crossed the threshold. It was a quiet ritual, unspoken yet deeply felt, a thread of understanding woven between them. Meanwhile, May had started a secret ledger, hidden beneath the rough burlap of flour sacks. Not for tallying coins, but for preserving fragments of the past. Her mother's delicate script, once dashed across tattered linen and now blurred by time, was being painstakingly traced by May's own weathered fingers into precise, resolute lines. Recipes like cornbread without a hint of sweetness, hearty beef stew brimming with earthy root vegetables, and molasses pudding so dense it could hush even the rowdiest cowboy. These were more than mere instructions. They were whispers of hope, visions of a future where she might claim a modest corner of the world, a kitchen without creaking stairs to climb, and a sign out front that truly meant welcome. She was tending to a simmering pot of onion broth, its sharp aroma filling the air, when Caleb trudged in, snow clinging to his broad shoulders like a reluctant crown. "Coffee's hot," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the pot. He gave a slight nod, stepping to the counter where the tin cup awaited, tendrils of steam rising like fragile spirits. He sipped in silence. After a pause, she ventured without turning. "What did you once think I was?" He hesitated, then lowered the cup with care. "I thought you were unbreakable," he replied, his voice steady. "From that first moment at the bell, you didn't even flinch." She stilled her spoon. He continued softer. "But I also thought, were you afraid of me?" "Of myself?" she countered, her tone a quiet challenge. "Afraid of what it revealed about me, standing there, just watching, afraid I was no different from the men who jeered." The silence that settled between them wasn't harsh, it bore the weight of shared scars. Then he confessed, "I've replayed that night in my mind every single day since." At last she turned, her eyes meeting his, raw, with unspoken history. How could a single moment carry so much? As the weight of his confession lingered in the air from moments before, Caleb's words struck a deeper chord. "Why reveal this now?" I wondered. His answer came with a raw honesty that cut through the silence. "Because I owe you far more than just soup and chopped wood." May stepped closer, her hands brushing against her worn apron, a gesture of quiet resolve. "Is this your way?" she asked, her voice tinged with both challenge and curiosity. "To carry guilt like a burden, hoping it somehow transforms into salvation." Caleb flinched, the question piercing through his guarded exterior. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, his voice a fragile thread. "I only know I'm desperate to become more than the man I used to be." Her gaze lingered on him, searching. No longer just a stranger shrouded in mystery, he had become an enigma that begged unraveling. Perhaps that's why, with a tenderness that surprised even herself, she murmured, "So, who are you, truly, right now?" A pause heavy with unspoken truths before he exhaled, as if releasing a long-held burden. "I'm Caleb Stone." May's eyes widened. "Stone? As in Stone River Ranch?" He gave a slow nod. "My father owns it. I grew up here, but after the war, I left, returned last spring, and begged him to keep my identity hidden from the men. I wanted to earn my place, not have it handed to me." May's expression froze, a storm brewing behind her stillness. "So, all this time," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "you've been hiding behind a facade?" "No," Caleb countered, stepping nearer, his tone earnest. "I've been striving to match your honesty with my own." She shook her head, retreating a step. "You men," she said, bitterness lacing her words, "always wearing masks, pretending to be nobler than the last, yet still judging a woman by the scars of her past." "Not you," Caleb insisted, his voice a quiet plea. Her breath caught, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Then why the deception?" she pressed. "I didn't deceive," he replied gently. "I simply didn't start with a name that never shoveled hay or kindled a flame." Her gaze drifted away, lost in thought. Outside, the snowfall had ceased, yet the chill seemed to seep through the walls, pressing in. May turned back to the stove, stirring the simmering soup with a distracted hand. Caleb stood, waiting, saying, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. At last, she spooned some into a bowl and placed it on the rough-hewn table. "It's hotter than before," she warned, her tone clipped yet not unkind. "But it cools quickly." He sat, the weight of her words and the warmth of the bowl grounding him in the moment. As the conversation lingered, he grasped the spoon with a tenderness that caught her off guard, murmuring with quiet conviction, "So it is with most treasures worth the wait." May held her tongue, yet she neither fled the room nor averted her gaze. At the first hint of dawn, a faint blush of light smeared across the snowy expanse, barely piercing the heavy shadow of the ridge. May gathered her belongings into a weathered canvas satchel. Her hands moved with a silent rhythm, honed by years of routine, folding her soul-spare apron, securing a scarf over her hair, and nestling the worn, leather-bound cookbook under her arm. The fire lay neglected, its coals long since chilled from the night's passing, and her boots whispered against the icy yard as she stepped out. The bunkhouse remained hushed, not even the horses stirring with their usual restless pawing. Only the wind sighed, carrying a tone of unspoken sorrow. May hesitated at the cookhouse door, her eyes tracing the porch, where Caleb often lingered before the sun rose, feigning interest in a cup of coffee. But he wasn't there. A breath escaped her, sharp and heavy. Her heart didn't merely ache, it seared, as if something vital was being wrenched from her very marrow. Inside, the shelves still bore her touch. Jars of pickled onions, spices bundled in waxed paper, a loaf of bread cooling in vain. Yet none of it was truly hers. This ranch, This hearth, they had always belonged to another. She left behind her key, a simple bent nail on a string, dangling by the stove, and stepped away. Caleb hadn't slept that night. Snow fell once more, dry and unsettled, dancing in frail flurries that tangled in his hair and slipped, melting, beneath his coat's collar. He stood for endless hours before the darkened cookhouse, staring at the lifeless chimney and the silent windows. Words had failed him as she departed, not for lack of desire to hold her back, but for the weight of what remained unsaid. How could silence feel so deafening? As the weight of unspoken words pressed down on him, he refused to become just another voice weaving honeyed traps around her heart. No, he would not join that chorus of empty promises. Instead, he lingered in the suffocating stillness of the night, his mind a storm of regrets, haunted by all the things he should have poured out but kept locked inside. The burning in his chest was more than mere guilt. It was the raw, piercing sorrow of a man who had arrived too late, with hands too empty to offer anything of worth. Oh, how that truth gnawed at him! When the snow began to fall heavier, cloaking the world in a frigid shroud, he retreated indoors. He sank into the chair at the small, weathered table May had polished with care each dawn, her quiet diligence a memory that stung. His gaze fell on the worn book she always kept close, nestled among the flour sacks, her mother's recipes, the fragile thread of her dreams. With a trembling hand, he pulled it toward him, pausing before tearing a blank page from the back. Then he began to write. The letter was brief, yet each word carved itself from his soul, heavier than any confession he had ever dared to speak. If I could be another man, if time could unravel like a spool of thread, I would be the one on my knees, scrubbing that floor beside you, not the coward who stood by and looked away. You've always towered above me in strength, in grace. Even now, you do. I don't beg for forgiveness, only for you to know this. When you walked into my darkness, Caleb, it was the first warmth I'd ever felt. He folded the letter with deliberate care, slipping it into the front cover of her cherished cookbook, and placed it on the table's edge, where her eyes couldn't miss it if she ever returned. But hope was a fragile thing, and he harbored none. Not after everything. On the third night, May found it. She had ventured only as far as the town's boarding house, her meager savings barely stretching to cover a week's stay on a creaky cot with bitter tea. The cookbook had remained untouched in her bag, a silent burden, until that moment. As she opened it, her fingers hesitated, tracing the edge of a new beginning, or perhaps an end, while she pondered rewriting a simple soup, unaware of the words waiting to unravel her. As the delicate edge of the paper slipped free from its hiding place, her heart caught in her throat. She unfolded the letter with trembling fingers, each crease revealing words she devoured not once but twice before clutching it to her chest. Her eyes fluttered shut, as if to seal the message within her soul. Beyond the fragile window panes, the snow wailed, a relentless tempest, while the wind howled with the fury of a beast unchained. Yet within her, a quiet warmth began to bloom, not enough to melt the lingering ache, for that would demand time, but enough to whisper a fragile hope. Could it be? Was it possible that not every heart arrived too late, that some simply awaited a spark too fierce to extinguish? Under the tender gaze of the sun, golden light cascaded over the vast Montana plains, bathing a humble structure in its glow. Nestled by an ancient trail, once trodden by thundering cattle drives, now guiding weary souls to solace, stood a modest building. Above its door, a hand-carved sign danced in the breeze, bearing the name May's Table. The sprawling porch welcomed all, with weathered benches where grizzled cowboys puffed on pipes and children's laughter mingled with the sweet tang of jam-smeared biscuits. Inside, the air was a comforting embrace of cinnamon and smoked pork, while walls cradled shelves of worn books and gleaming jars of preserves. Each morning, a freshly baked pie adorned the long wooden counter, and behind it stood May, her hand steady, her laughter now a melody of ease. No longer did she startle at sharp tones or heavy footsteps. She wore her apron like a badge of honor. By the window, a painted tin labeled Dreams held her quiet lessons for local girls, teaching them to save their meager coins for aspirations worth chasing. Outside, Caleb knelt in the herb garden, sleeves rolled high, hands caked with earth. He murmured to the basil as if it were a confidant, tending to the tomatoes with the reverence of a man who understood the weight of new beginnings. Words were still scarce on his lips, but when his gaze met May's, it shone clear, unburdened by guilt or darkness. Every Saturday, the village children flocked to their haven, their eager voices a promise of life unfolding anew. As the echoes of past struggles faded from the previous chapter, the warmth of the back door at May and Caleb's humble haven welcomed all who entered. May, with her boundless spirit, taught eager hands the art of kneading dough, the subtle signs of oil too fierce in the pan, and the joy of laughter when flour dusted their hair like playful snow. Over simmering stew, her voice wove tales of wonder, sidestepping shadows of yesteryears unless a curious soul dared to ask. She carried her history quietly, a silent strength in every stir. Occasionally, wanderers found their way to this sanctuary. A newcomer, drawn by whispers of her kitchen's magic, would lean over the worn counter, curiosity alight. "Ma'am, your cooking feels like a lifelong craft. Where did you hone such skill?" May, wiping her hands on her faded apron, would cast a tender glance at Caleb, who chopped onions with steady focus behind her. With a smile soft as dawn, she'd reply, "I once cooked for strangers who never cared to know me. Now I pour my heart into meals for a man who truly sees me." Her words, simple yet profound, silenced further questions. How could one probe deeper into such raw, unspoken devotion? Their wedding day bloomed in understated beauty. The meadow, kissed by the late spring sun, cradled them in serenity, wildflowers swaying as if in quiet celebration. May donned a dress of her own making, plain cream linen adorned with a blue ribbon Caleb had salvaged from a forgotten drawer. He stood in his finest shirt, his gentle smile a beacon, beneath a gnarled oak with just 2 witnesses and a preacher whose voice barely stirred the air. They sealed their bond. Yet the moment stretched beyond any spoken word, eternal in its stillness. At the close, Caleb drew a humble handkerchief from his coat, simple cotton, not silk, bearing the embroidered word, "Forgiven," in weathered red thread. He tied it around May's wrist, a silent promise more powerful than any vow. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with a radiant peace. "Thank you," she breathed. He shook his head, voice low and earnest. "No, thank you for staying when I gave you every reason to leave." They turned, bound by a love that needed no further words. As they walked side by side toward the winding trail, their hands entwined, the golden sunlight danced across the delicate embroidery on her wrist, illuminating their shared resolve. There was no need to flee any longer. Together, they had forged something unbreakable, a bond impervious to the flames of destruction, the weight of shame, or even the haunting echoes of memory. This moment marked the dawn of everything they had dared to dream. Oh, what a journey it has been! From the smoky haze of forgotten kitchens to the heavy stillness of unspoken regrets, and finally to the tender embrace of redemption, haven't we felt every heartbeat? May and Caleb's tale whispers a profound truth. The past does not carve our destiny. It is the choices we make and the futures we build that define us. True love, in all its raw beauty, seeks not perfection but honesty, and the bravery to stand unwaveringly by its side. If their story has stirred your soul, know that countless others await in the untamed wilderness of the heart. Join us at Wild West Love Stories, where tales of grit, fiery passion, and second chances come alive. Set against a rugged land where the wind carries whispers of old wounds, and every soul yearns for its own frontier, these stories beckon. Thank you, from the depths of our hearts, for riding alongside us on this unforgettable journey. If this tale touched you, please leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Hit that bell to never miss a story. And let's keep riding together, where love may not always be polished, but its worth is undeniable.